Very good morning to all my dear learners. How are you everyone? I hope you all are safe and fine at your places. And I truly believe that the learning process is really going on well. And as you all know students, if you're going to talk about the things like physiology and sports and jury, so definitely it brings a great enthusiasm in us and we'll be going to start a new thing, right? So let's begin this session. In this session, this is part number 10 and we're going on with physiology and sports injury. This is unit number 7. This is the last session, this is the last topic of this chapter, that is unit 7, named Physiology and Sports Injury. Basically, whenever we talk about sports injury, we have some points in our mind, right? So whenever I am talking about sports injuries, you must understand sports medicine and so many things. Definitely we'll do revision in this part also. Right now we'll have to understand the management of heart tissue injury, right? So management of heart tissue injuries. When we talk about the management of heart tissue injury, we need to talk more upon bones. It means the injury which is occurred over the bones. We have two things here, that is the bone injury and the second thing is bone as well as muscles. Right? So heart tissue injury is basically concerning with the bones. When I am talking about bones, so it is fracture. What is it? It is related to the fracture. Now see, whenever I am telling about fracture, so it's very important to know what exactly fracture is, what exactly bone deformity is, right? So fracture basically whenever we concern on it, right? Whenever we have a concerning regarding this fracture and all, so we must know things properly, right? So it's very important basically to go for it so that we can understood things nicely, right? So fracture is basically concerning, it's a bone breakup by some external pressure. It may be slightly breakage or it may be complete breakage. Okay? Fracture may be simple, fracture may be complicated. It may be incomplete or sometimes due to wrong treatment, fracture become very dangerous. Thus, to be handled by the expert doctor is very important. First aid step is to stop bleeding and resting for the moment. Okay, so basically when I am talking about the fracture, so what exactly fracture is? Fracture is basically, it's a problem over the bones. What is it? Just let me give 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So fracture is what? It is a breakup of bones. Fracture is a breakup of bone. It may be. So fracture is of two types, I told you. Open fracture closed fracture. Whenever I am talking about open fracture or whenever I am talking about the closed fracture, so first thing that we need to keep in mind is about the open fracture. Okay, so open fracture, it means in this fracture there is a cut over the skin by the sharp edges of broken bones. The bones by some external object comes out. Okay, so when the bone come out from the skin, from the body, we simply called it open fracture. Okay, so from whenever there is a cut in your skin and the bone comes out due to some external reason, we called 8, open fracture. So if we talk about the next thing, that is the closed fracture. So whenever we talk about closed fracture, it means the fracture is happened. Okay, fracture is happened, but it is inside, not outside. It is inside. So here I am gonna tell you about symptoms of injury, and I'll tell you everything. So before we're going to start, I'll just show how that the very important thing. It's a 5 marks question, and you should go it properly. It's a very important question, right, students? We must go it properly, right? So let's begin with this, and we're gonna quickly adjust it. Yes, exactly, fine. Okay, so let's begin with this. Okay, just give me 1 minute, students. Okay, fine. So let's start first to make the diagrams, right? So first thing, the first diagram that I'm going to make is like this. Okay, I'm going to make bones. This is the first diagram I have made. So let's make around 7. Let's make this. You will have to make also. Okay. One, two, three, four, five. I'll show you some kind of fractures in our bones. Okay. Let's suppose this kind of structure we have for bone. If you see, guys. Okay, folks. Right. Good. So 3, 3, 6, 7. Okay. First fracture that I'm going to tell you, that I'm going to teach you, is transverse fracture. In transverse fracture, this is fracture number A, transverse fracture, which means a transversely fracture. Right? Now I'm going to tell you linear fracture. Which fracture? Linear fracture. This was what? Transverse fracture. Transverse fracture, you can see number 1, V1. This is the 5 marks question, students. Please go through it properly. Okay? So linear fracture, it means like this. This is the linear fracture. जब बीच में से कहीं टूट गया, कुछ ब्रेकअप हुआ, कुछ hairline चीजें हुई, right? Now if I am going to tell you oblique, ऐसा oblique करके टूटना, right? तो oblique but not displaced. हमारी जो बोन है वो टूटी है लेकिन डिस्प्लेस नहीं हुई है, और सिर्फ तिरछी. Oblique but non displaced. Is that clear? Right? Now the next fracture that I am going to teach you here is that is the V1. This is oblique. Transverse ऐसे हुआ है. Transversal not oblique. And displaced. ये कैसा है? Displaced अलग अलग हुई bones. Oblique and displaced. Got it this point? Now I am going to tell you spiral fracture. Which fracture? Spiral. So whenever there is a spiral fracture, you know. So जब आपका पूरा ऐसे वाला स्पाइरल कुछ हो, मुड़ जाए पैर बहुत एक्सट्रीम लेवल तक, स्पाइरल फ्रैक्चर. ये कौन सा था हमारा डी, दैट इज ई वाला. नाउ ई इज व्हाट? इट इज स्पाइरल फ्रैक्चर. Spiral fracture. Got it this one? I hope this part is exactly clean. Now ब्रेनिस्टिक फ्रैक्चर क्या होता है, साइड से आपको कुछ लगे, लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल इतना इतना रीजन हो गया प्रॉब्लम, राइट, दिस इज द F1 and we call it ब्रेनिस्टिक. This is the brainstem fracture F, right? Now I will tell you comminuted fracture, right? Which fracture? Comminuted. Okay, COMMINUTED, comminuted. Okay, so let's come to this one. Comminuted fracture. Right? So here you can see that when we talk about fracture, ये जितने भी diagram में बनाए you will have to make an example. Okay, whenever it is asking for fracture. So now let's understand. You understood? You mark my words. I'll be telling you what is fracture, how to deal with fracture, what are the symptoms of fracture, and so many things. Then we'll be discuss about dislocation and all other things. Right? Let's first talk over the joints injury, okay, or we can also have a look on the bones injury. So if we talk about the bone injury, we have different kinds of injury in bones, right? As you can see, a simple fracture, which is the A, transverse fracture, A1, right? So simple fracture, a broken bone in a single part of the body in the absence of wooden and simple fracture, right? Compound fracture if I told you तो oblique non displaced या oblique displaced जो है वो compound fracture हो सकता है. Got it? So bone injury are serious injury. These are very painful. If this if we talk about this bone injury, so it's a serious injury and it is very painful. If bone injuries are not handled properly, it may lead to permanent disability, thus to be handled by an expert doctor, right? So we should understand that the bone injury are serious injury and we need to understand its requirement, what to do, what not to do, and we should be careful by these all injuries. Okay, so bone injuries are really very serious injuries and these are very painful. Bone injuries may create permanent disability, no? So bone injury may be sometimes very serious and it may create permanent disability. Okay, so if we talk about the first aid of this, so whenever there is a bone injury, so one should stop to show any motion. You are not at all allowed to show any motion of the joint which is affected. Okay, so if there is a bleeding, we need to go for the stop the bleeding, internal as well as external. Sometimes we need to go for cryotherapy. In fractures, we need to go for cryotherapy. What is this cryotherapy? It means ice therapy is also called simply cryotherapy. Okay, student. Now, bone injury can be classified as dislocation or fracture. So right now we are learning fracture. Okay. So what is fracture exactly? It's this injury, bone breakup up to some extent due to the external pressure. So yes, just because of the external pressure, just because of in the spots, just because of somehow, some kuch karanon se, right? Due to some kind of problem, due to some kind of external pressure, right? Due to some external pressure, it happens, right? Okay. Students, we were talking about the fracture, its management. Right? So fracture, if I'm gonna talk about this fracture, so it's very, very important for us to go in depth, right? So I'll be telling you the definition of each and every kind of fracture now, right? If I'm going to talk about the complete fracture, right? The very first fracture is complete fracture. So if we talk about the complete fracture, when bone is totally break into two pieces, right? So whenever the bone is break down into two pieces, we simply called it the complete fracture. So fracture may be complete, fracture may be incomplete. When the bone is completely divided into two different parts, we called it complete fracture. And if the bone is not completely divided into two parts, we called it incomplete fracture. It means when we talk about the incomplete fracture, the bone is cracked or partially break up. The bone is cracked or partially break up. Next thing that we need to keep in mind is green stick fracture. Green stick fracture, as you can see the fracture number F, right? If you can see the fracture number F, that is the green stick fracture. In these green stick fracture, there it is called the hairline fracture, and it is not a complete fracture, right? So when bone is bent with mild cracking, the bone does not break completely. We called it this kind of fracture the green stick fracture or the hairline fracture. What we called? We called this one. I am talking about this fracture, that is the E1. Okay. So let's come back. We're gonna, we'll have to just let me just yeah, fine, exactly. Okay, so we were discussing about the fractures like the green stick fractures, complete and incomplete. So whenever we talk about the green stick fracture, which is also called the hairline fracture, so to define it is when bone is bent with mild cracking, the bone does not break completely. We call it green stick fracture. Comminuted fracture. As you can see, the last, that is the last fractures that I am telling you is comminuted fracture. This fracture I am telling you, right? So when we tell this is comminuted fracture, right? So comminuted fracture means chura ho jana. Bones ka kya hota hai? Iske baad mein यहाँ पे chura hota hai. This is the G. When the bones break down and it becomes crush होकर उसका टूट जाना, right? So that is what the comminuted fracture. I mean fracture. Okay, so this comminuted fracture when bone is broken into many small pieces at the site of fracture. तो जब हम fracture हुआ, as you can see the G1, the G वाला जो fracture हमने show किया है वो पे you can see what happened here. It happens that when the site of fracture there is a lot of pieces of fracture. We call it a comminuted fracture. Impact fracture, it means when bone is driven into another bone. When broken pieces are prostituted into the bones and parts of the impact. If you can see the transverse fracture, first wala jo A wala hai, that is you can see that is the transverse fracture. These type of fracture is caused due to the breaking of bones with the right angle while the axis of bones. Stress fracture, if we talk about, the next type of fracture is stress fracture. A stress fracture is also known as hairline fracture. It is also called repeated stress over time. It is mostly occur in jumping events. Bone is pressed from a corner and it causes partial damage to the bone. If we talk about the oblique fracture, right? Oblique fracture, oblique non-displaced, oblique displaced, you can see. So oblique fracture is that in which bone breaks diagonally. And if it breaks up diagonally and it will not divide into two, we call it oblique non-displaced. And if it broken up obliquely and it is displaced, divided into two parts, different, we call it oblique displace. Compound fracture is basically breaking by a bone along with dislocation. So when dislocation occurs and the fracture, we call it broken into two pieces. Right? So when dislocation occurs as well as the bone is break up, so we call it compound fracture. Next is complicated fracture. बच्चे see complicated fracture में क्या होता है? The bone is crushed more over the delicate organs like brain, heart, liver, kidney, blood vessels are damaged. So when let us suppose the hand, if you talk about the rib cage, yeah? So when the rib cage bone is break up and it crushed and it moreover the delicate organs like heart or lungs, they are affected with it. So we called it complicated fracture. What we called it? We called it complicated fracture. Students, now we are going to begin with the next thing, that is the dislocation, right? So let's begin with it and we are going to see the dislocation, how it occurs, and definitely fracture part is completed. Now we are going to see the dislocation, then we will do the reconstruction also, right? So let me just start rubbing it as and when I turn. I'll just tell you. Okay. So let's talk on dislocation. Okay, students. Dislocation. When we talk about dislocation, so dislocation, let us suppose we have a kind of let's take an example that we have shoulder dislocation, right? So if we're gonna talk about shoulder dislocation, let's see how we're going to talk it about. So when we talk about shoulder dislocation, right? So students, let's just make it and let's tell you how to. Let's suppose this is the shoulder location, right? And in the shoulder there is a bone. Here is the bone, right? Here is the bone. So this is my shoulder location, right? Now this is the normal anatomy of the shoulder. This is the normal anatomy of the shoulder. Now what happens in the same? If this bone is gone down, displaced down, it means it is interior. तो ये कौन सा डिसलोकेशन होगा बच्चे? इंटीरियर डिसलोकेशन. जब ये बोन कहाँ आ रही है? नीचे शिफ्ट हो रही है, तो क्या करेंगे? इंटीरियर डिसलोकेशन. And if this bone is this is a simple question, right? So we call it normal anatomy of shoulder. नॉर्मल एनाटॉमी ऑफ शोल्डर, दिस इज द एंटीरियर डिसलोकेशन. अब हम पोस्टीरियर डिसलोकेशन भी बता देते हैं आपको. सो सिंपल, देखो इट्स वेरी इजी टू मेक डायग्राम्स. इफ यू मेक दिस डायग्राम इन एग्जाम इट विल बी सो सिंपल. समझने का देयर इज नथिंग सच एज काइंड ऑफ दिस इज द शोल्डर एंड ये जो बोन है, अगर ये पोस्टीरियर साइड में क्या हो रही है? डिस्प्लेस हुई, मतलब ये पोस्टीरियर बाहर चली गई. सो दिस इज पोस्टीरियर डिसलोकेशन. Posterior dislocation. ये क्या पढ़ा हमने dislocation के students? What is dislocation exactly? When the adjoining bones are displaced from their original position, right? So whenever the dislocation occurs, so the these bones are displaced from the original position, and on that time we call these things, what we called it? We simply called it dislocation. So if I am talking about fracture, okay, तो बच्चे see I have two things to say here. What are the symptoms of bone injury? अगर आपको dislocation हुआ है, अगर आपको fracture हुआ है, so we have some parameters to see. Very first thing is to know the symptoms. Whenever there is a bone injury, so there is a severe pain around the joint, right? So whenever there is a bone injury, there is a severe pain around the fracture, around the joint of the bone. The joint, the bone will look deformed and swelling around the affected part. The very first thing is what? Pain. Second thing is swelling, and it started to looking deformed, right? So whenever your body started to looking deformed, the bone structure started to looking deformed, it means you can understand it very nicely that there is some problem in that, right? So whenever there is a bone injury, there is a fracture or there is a dislocation, what happens is that there will be severe pain around the joint, around the fracture. Second thing, the bone structure will look deformed. How it will look like? It will look like deformed. Okay? So this joint will be deformed and there will be swelling around the region. So you must go for the anti-inflammatory cream. Now see, whenever there is a dislocation or such kind of problems, you must go to the expert doctor as fast as possible. And you should not do any mobility out of it, right? So see, generally what happens, the temperature rises, the local temperature rises, and fracture part is different. Okay, so no movement is possible. Okay, so let me tell you the symptoms of bone injury. There are 5 symptoms. So I am going to tell you 4 to 5 symptoms. Symptoms of bone injuries. Very first system is pain over joint. Pain over joint or wherever the fracture. Second thing is there will be swelling in that part. Swelling. There will be no mobility. Okay. No mobility. The structure will look like deformed. The structure will look like deformed. The bone structure, right? The structure will look like deformed. Second thing, that is the fifth form, right? Local temperature ranges. Local temperature is. If all these things happen, so you should clear in the mind कि बच्चे आपको क्या है bone injury, right? So bone injury when we occur, there will be pain, there will be swelling, there will be, you will be not able to move that part. There will be the structure will look deformed, and then the local temperature will enhance. So like feverish, and you will find kind of things, right? So whenever there is a bone injury, these all symptoms, right? These all symptoms will be there, and you will have to feel like this kind of things, no? So I hope you got it this part. Now if I am going to talk about first aid management of bone injury, right? So when we talk about first aid management of bone injury, do not move the joint. अब आपको करना क्या है? What exactly you will have to do when there is a bone injury? Okay, so whenever there is a bone injury, what you need to do? So simple thing that you need to go for. Okay, what is that thing? That thing is, first thing, do not move the joint or bone. You are not at all supposed to move the joint. आपको आपका जो joint है, you do not have to move it. The victim should be kept at the comfortable position. या तो lay down, लेटा दिया जाए, or he or she will have to be at a comfortable position. That's it. Okay. So apply cold pack of ice cream to reduce the swelling, and if there is an internal bleeding, so we need to stop it, right? So basically what happened whenever there is a injury in bone, so we need to take care of it and we need to work on it properly. Like if you having a bone injury, so what you basically needed to go for is that you need to apply ice pack on it so that the pain will be reduced, the swelling will be reduced, and the internal bleeding will be stopped. Okay. Second thing, provide support by strip or splint bandage and prevent further movement. Moreover, there is a relief to the victim. So we need to provide support to that particular, like if it is in hand, so you will have to provide support to it. If it is in leg, you will have to provide support to it. That's it. That's the only thing that you need to keep in your mind. Got it? So next thing is, patient should be handled by an expert doctor. X-ray should be taken, diagnosis should be done properly. The expert should manage the mobility and applying plasters or enable the joint to take a real position. See if these joints are not, this kind of problems are not taken care for longer duration. So the deposition of some muscles started in that particular position and the structure will not be fine as it was earlier. So we need to be very much curious, we need to be very much concerning about this all things. Right? The mobility should be, the immobility should be for 5 to 6 weeks as per the expert doctor advice. Okay? After the full treatment of the dislocation, joints fracture should allow in progressive way. It means the rehabilitation should be done. So basically, whenever we talk about the rehabilitation, तो बच्चे जब भी आपको skin problem हो, it means the skin injury. Whenever you have a bone injury, so we need to go for one thing. Let me wrap it. I hope this all part is clear to everyone. And just we are going to recapitulate it. Okay, everything we are going to recapitulate. This will be relaxed. Okay, so students, first thing, let us talk. Whenever there is injury, it may be soft tissue injury, it may be hard tissue injury, we need to go for pricing. Protection, we have that is the rest, ice, protection रखिए, like warming up and so many things. You should go. अगर हो गया है injury, you need to rest. Then फिर वो strain हो, sprain हो, dislocation हो, fracture हो, you need to be rest. You need to go for ice pack. You have to apply ice. Okay, compression. After compression, you go for the elevation. Elevation when it also ठीक हो, you have to rotate your hands and all these things will start to do. Next is rehabilitation. Okay, so this 5 things, इसका full form भी पूछा जाता है एग्जाम में. So in 1 marks में full form पूछ के इसके साथ पूछा जाएगा explain the types of fracture. So write this in 1 marks and then you have to explain fracture. You have to explain dislocation, right? Next is let's recapitulate it properly. So where we had started a thing with soft tissue injury or like this, right? So let's write it here. Classification of sports injury in short. Sports injury. We all know there are 2 types of injury: soft tissue injury and we have hard tissue injury. Hard tissue injuries. When we talk about soft tissue injury, there are again 2 things: injuries over the skin and injuries over muscles. When we talk about injuries over the skin, there is contusion. Contusion is basically what? It is whenever there is a blunt object hit on our body, whenever there is an impact of blunt object is lead to green, yellow or black patches on the body without breaking the continuity of the skin. That is the contusion. Next is laceration. Deep cut by blunt object. Incision. Okay. So contusion, incision, laceration and abrasion. If we talk about abrasion, so abrasion is what? Abrasion is when the body is rubbed with the surface. जब friction के कारण आपकी body rub हो रही है, that is called the abrasion. Yes, जाना किसी चीज से. If we talk about muscle injury, so there is strain, which is also called the muscle pull, sprain. Next thing, that is the cramp. When we talk about strain, so strain is basically muscle pull over a stretch of muscles, over stretching of muscles. When we talk about cramp, so cramp is the inability of muscles to contract properly. Okay, when your muscles are not able to contract properly, we call it cramp. Whenever we talk about sprain, so जब आपकी body ligaments, tendons से बहुत ज़्यादा overstretched रहेंगे, we call it strain. If we talk about the hard tissue injury, so hard tissue injury is fracture. It means it's bone related. If we talk about dislocation, right? So in dislocation we need to deal with some other things, like in this fracture we have complete fracture, incomplete fracture, or we have open fracture, closed fracture. Dislocation I have shown you anterior position and various kind of things. So this is all about the classification of sports injury, the management of the various sports injury. It is very important for us to go through all these things very nicely, properly, right? So students, I hope you understand all these things. This session was very important. It was very, according to CBSE, we have a 5 marks question, right? So you should go it properly. क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ स्पोर्ट्स इंजरी वे डेफिनेटली 10 मार्क्स की चीजें यहाँ से हमको आने वाली हैं, राइट। तो एमसीक्यू के फॉर्म में इफ यू टॉक अबाउट एमसीक्यू, if you talk about 3 marks question or 5 marks question, everything will become from. So इस चैप्टर को you have to perform or prepare very nicely. Go for this, go for all this. I'll provide you a question papers also for the practice session, right? So just go through everything properly. I hope you understand all these things properly. With us, take care. Bye bye. A lot of love and blessings to you.